For decades, water from it has been overused, and now a new study shows where it's all going. Joining me to discuss the study's findings is Alan Halaly, water reporter for the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Alan, welcome, and tell us, Colorado River water, where is it all going?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's something that scientists have wondered for decades, and they've tried to figure out. And this data kind of shows us the most definitive account of where all this water is going. The main takeaway is that alfalfa, which is used for cattle grazing and to feed other farm animals, and other hays, takes about 46% of the Colorado River water, and agriculture in general takes about 52%. So those are big numbers when you compare to 18% to municipal water use, especially that's something that's front of mind for Southern Nevadans who have to rip out their grass. So there's a lot of interest in, how we're using all this water that we're continuing to negotiate.
What have reactions to this study been?
Well, I think scientists are interested in kind of getting this information out there before this looming deadline of 2026 to reallocate the Colorado River. Every state gets a certain amount of water that they're allowed to use, Nevada being the lowest amount of water. And before they're trying to rush to do these negotiations before the election, which could, see a major shakeup in the Bureau of Reclamation. So I think the main takeaway is, negotiators now have the most accurate, up-to-date information as to, where all this water is going. I don't think it's very surprising for them. Very often we like to point the finger at agriculture as being this, big water user that we need to regulate. So it's interesting to see kind of the timing of it as well, as, there's this big disagreement between the upper and lower basin and how to proceed.
And you talk about agriculture, but Nevada has a lot of agriculture as well. Alfalfa hay is the state's leading cash crop. How does this study impact Nevada's role in those negotiations?
Yeah, it's interesting. There's a distinction that needs to be made. Most of Nevada's agriculture is dependent on our groundwater. In these rural parts of the state that don't have big pipelines coming from Lake Mead, they need to rely on this over-appropriated groundwater. There's more rights given to farmers than there is on paper, or than there is actually in the basin. So, I think it's interesting, and we're thinking about how to rectify this. Can we put more water efficient crops in? Will that even fix the problem? And Nevada isn't necessarily a big agricultural force in the context of the country or even the Southwest. California's Imperial Valley is a big producer, as well as kind of near Arizona and Yuma. There's a small portion of farming that's based on this Colorado River water, but at least in Nevada, most of it is from the ground.
And in these negotiations of the Colorado River, there is the upper basin and then there is the lower basin. Which might benefit most from this study?
It's a good question. The big question right now is, there's this thing called the structural deficit, the water that we lose to evaporation, which is studied in this new paper. It's about 1.5 million acre feet that both basins agree that the lower basin, including us, Nevada, California, and Arizona, should shoulder those cuts. But past that, there's this question of, should the upper basin be required to take cuts, even though they don't benefit from big reservoirs like Lake Mead or Lake Powell? So that's kind of the nexus of the disagreement. And this study, I think, could maybe help them think about solutions. I think it's important for, there's 40 million people that benefit from the Colorado River, and there's a whole lot of local leaders that would be interested to know that farming is taking so much of their water. So I think there's a lot of implications going forward in, how we regulate farming and, what the solutions to this big 2.5 decade drought that we've had here in the Southwest.
Do farmers react to these studies?
It's interesting. I always point to that ProPublica investigation where one farming family they found uses more water than the entire Las Vegas Valley. And I think that might be shocking for people to know. But, you read that story and the farmers are like, well, we have the right to do that. And they do. they have these senior water rights to use this Colorado River water, compared to, say, these native tribes that benefit from it that don't even get their full allocation, that, water that should be theirs anyway.
And that family is from the Imperial Valley.
From the Imperial Valley in California.
For your article, you spoke with Sarah Porter. She's the director of Arizona State University's Kyle Center for Water Policy, and she said that the solutions to this have to be nuanced. What did she mean by that?
Right. I mean, you could say the solution is to point to alfalfa and rip it all out, and that could be the path forward. But there's all these local economies in these rural parts of California and Arizona and even here in Nevada. They depend on alfalfa and agriculture for to live and to support their livelihoods. So there's questions about, if we change that crop, is that even going to fix the problem? Very often, farmers in the Southwest will use the warm weather to grow year-round, which is also contributing to that high water use. So there's a lot of questions about, how can we best regulate agriculture in a way that, is both amenable to these local economies that depend on it, and places like Southern Nevada, which are struggling to meet these big conservation deadlines.
With a growing population.
Absolutely.
Last thing, the snowpack typically peaks around this time up in the Rocky Mountains, melts and gets down to Lake Mead eventually. What's it looking like now? How is it going to affect Lake Mead water levels?
Yeah, it's a good question. Last year was a record wet year. They measure it in a 30-year average, and we were hovering for most of the year at about 130% of that 30-year average. This year, we're kind of closer to 103, 105%, which is good news because generally hydrologists will tell you that a very wet year is followed by a very dry one and a series of dry ones. So we do have this wet year that isn't as wet as last year, but is generally good news for Lake Mead. I will say those projections that they release at the beginning of every month, they do about 2 years. They try to figure out where the water levels are going to be at every month. And we are going to be close to that 2022 record low. So by the end of 2025. So there is, it kind of ebbs and flows depending on the season. Of course, we're dependent on snowpack and releases from Lake Powell. But, I think generally it's good news, but I think most hydrologists would tell you that in the future, we should be expecting more dry years to come.
Alan Halaly of the Las Vegas Review-Journal, congratulations on making your Nevada Week debut and welcome to Las Vegas. You said you've been here for about 4 months from Florida. Your thoughts on Vegas so far?
Well, I will say it's very affordable. I can afford my own apartment on a starting salary. Housing affordability is something they're talking about right now.
Certainly.
But yeah, it's been great, and I love the culture here.
We look forward to having you back on.
Thank you.